I'm absolutely delighted that people could make it today, and we're recording it for those who couldn't make it but want to see it in the future. My name is Esme Fuller Thompson, and it's my privilege to be director of the Institute for Life Course and Aging. This is part of our noon hour lecture series, and we're so excited to have Kieran Walsh with us today. I'm just going to do a brief introduction and then I'll pass it on to Kieran. So, Kieran, we had the pleasure of having Kieran as a professor in residence or a visiting professor in residence here over the summer, which was a real delight. He's professor of aging and public policy in the discipline of economics and director of the Irish Centre for Social Gerontology within the Institute for Life Course and Society at the University of Galway in Ireland, which you'll hear as soon as he opens his mouth. So he's got a beautiful Irish brogue. His research focuses on aging in place, social exclusion in later life, and older people's lived experiences of major life transitions and inequality. He was chair of the RoseNet Cost Action Research Network on reducing old age social exclusion between 2016 and 2020, which was a 200-member network across 41 different countries. And he's currently the scientific coordinator of the Marie Sklodowska, sorry if Curie, so Marie Curie doctoral training network on advancing research and training on aging, place, and home called Home Age. And the topic today is on making and remaking a sense of home amidst later life homelessness. And so the little blurb to sort of set it up is that while there are concerns about homelessness and accommodation insecurity in later life, scholarly understanding of whether and how older people currently in homelessness can achieve a sense of home remains underdeveloped. This talk will explore the role of personal agency and environmental conditions in how older people in Ireland perceive and construct a sense of home amidst aging, homelessness, and insecurity across the life course. So, Kieran, we're delighted to have you today, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Esme, and you did a much better job of setting this up than I will ever do. So thank you for that, and thank you for the introduction and invitation. Thank you to Julia for all her work in facilitating this as well. So delighted to be here, delighted to be a part of the seminar series. And as Esme said, I spent a couple of months at the Institute and faculty during the summer, so I have very cherished memories of that already. So it's nice to be back even remotely. So I'm going to be speaking to you about remaking a sense of home across later life and the life course, and amidst later life homelessness. Sorry, just as I move around my video images here. And essentially, I suppose within this respect, I really want to kind of highlight a couple of different elements. One is about how our past and present environmental interactions intertwine with our own agency with respect to remaking that sense of home. So we're going to draw out that as we go along in terms of this presentation. This paper was completed in conjunction with my colleague Brian Carroll, who's based here at our institute. But there's also a number of caveats that I should kind of flag up before we begin. Depending on your background, you might wonder about this concept of sense of home. And we're using this concept as a broad construct that encompasses both quality of life, but really encompasses elements of well-being and elements of identity in later life. So it goes far beyond the idea of just physical dwelling. But that said, there is a key element here where we also have to recognize that stable housing is a key enabler of a sense of home for many individuals in later life. So I think these are two factors that we should hang on to as we move through the presentation in some ways. The second caveat is that this was a small scale analysis that was completed on one section of a larger study. And for that reason, it was really trying to elaborate more a conceptual explanation of some of the relationships that we are seeing here and witnessing within the data. And so we might have to dig a little bit deeper for the policy and practice recommendations, but hopefully not too deep. So we can discuss those afterwards if people have an interest in that aspect of the work. Okay, so So just by background, and I think Esme has already introduced some of these elements. So basically, we are seeing a lot more concern for the prevalence of environmental insecurity in later life. And typically, we do think about homelessness as a principal manifestation of that insecurity. And now we have a burgeoning research literature on aging out of place, on the range of deprivations and inequalities that can face people who can experience houselessness, and also a range of calls that suggest that we need to examine aging related public policy constructs such as healthy and active aging from the perspective of these conditions, these circumstances, and these subgroups of the older population as well. But we're still left with this question about whether older people can maintain and achieve a sense of home in homelessness. And so we need to unpack that a little bit. And there are a number of reasons why this question is really critical. And the first of these, it relates to policy and practice. So we've seen this very significant shift towards aging in place agendas across Western developed nations and many other international contexts. And ultimately, we have to validate what these agendas actually mean and their related constructs, in this case, sense of home, for diverse older populations living in diverse environmental conditions. And we're just not doing that enough to really make these agendas relevant to people's lives. Secondly, and as many people will know, and many people have called out already, including Amanda, who's based at the Institute, many of the supports and services that are designed to support people in the community and aging in place are very much built around the assumption that people have access to private stable dwellings and therefore can access services from these dwellings or receive services into those dwellings. And again, that's just not the case. So again, we have to interrogate what that means for our services and supports designed for diverse and heterogeneous older populations. Thirdly, we have to think about the ways in which homelessness in a very practical way can disrupt some of the interdependencies between older people and their environments. And these traditionally have been marked by an increased reliance on immediate neighborhoods and communities for everyday needs, for social contact and social interaction, and indeed, in many cases, for identity-related needs where people's identities are rooted very much in place-based constructs in some contexts and some situations. On top of that, we have to recognize a sense of home is a very important research construct. It is multidimensional and dynamic in nature and holds a variety of meanings for individuals that go beyond, again, this idea of just physical shelter. So they can incorporate wider communities, daily routines, social connections, and that sort of unfolding of life biographies within a particular environment or across different environments. So all these factors, either singularly or in combination, can imbue feelings of familiarity, security, and control, and can also bolster a sense of belonging, a sense of self, and very importantly, a sense of self-efficacy and our capacity to apply agency to our own lives to impact positively in our own lives and the lives of others around our environments as well. So older people can, through personal experiences and memories, kind of construct a whole range of different kinds of bonds. Bonds that are emotional, behavioral, and cognitive in form. And again, this just kind of really embeds that notion of a sense of home. Now, we also know from the international research that older people can face very significant changes in later life in their environmental context that effectively changes the meaning of being at home and effectively means that older people are engaged in a continual process of adaptation or reintegration with their environmental context to try and reestablish what those meanings actually are. So whether these are changes coming from your personal life in the context of ill health, in the context of bereavement, or in the context of just relationship change, or whether they're in the context of environmental change, which might be urban regeneration, urban redevelopment, rural depopulation, or rural decline, these are all factors that change the nature of what's happening in ourselves. So when we can engage in these processes, we can try and preserve some level of continuity despite the changes and uncertainties around our environment and happening in our lives. But in summary, I guess why we can say the sense of home is not just about the physical dwellings, as we've seen. It's all about those important things that we regard as being essential within our own environmental context and our capacity to address change across those various different factors that are really key. But all of this research that's been conducted so far has been primarily based on those living in permanent, stable dwellings and not in insecure environments or who have experienced homelessness. Now, there are a number of things that we can draw on from the international literature on older adult homelessness that suggest, as you would imagine, that there are very complex social and bureaucratic challenges in realizing a sense of home for people who are experiencing homelessness. And some of this relates to language. Language around conflations of house and home, issues around inequality of aging in precarious places and just that unequal aging trajectory because of those places. And also issues around how sometimes we can misclassify or misrepresent what are essentially survival strategies as more profound meaning making strategies, where actually those opportunities for those profound or meaning making elements are less available to people in these contexts. So we have to be very careful in terms of the sort of language that we use and the sort of ways that we frame some of these processes and ideas as well. On top of that, we also know from empirical studies there are a number of barriers that even if people emerge from homelessness, that can create barriers to trying to rebuild a sense of home even outside of homelessness. So in the context of studies on permanent supportive housing, we've seen some tensions between agency and choice, where, for example, elements of security, elements of surveillance, elements of rules within particular facilities or housing can actually impede that rebuilding of a sense of home, whereas the connection to everyday routines, connections to place and others can be really enablers of that. Ultimately, a little bit more of a nuanced view of how we move through life and in and out of a sense of place and perhaps a sense of home as well has emerged within the literature that suggests that it's sometimes independent of our tenure in particular environments or environmental insecurity in some ways, and more fundamentally related to ideas of control, comfort, privacy, and security as being key. So in this analysis, we want to tease some of these elements out, and we want to investigate how older people perceive and create a sense of home amidst aging, homelessness, and accommodation insecurities across the life course. In the analysis, we're focusing on those who are aged 50 years or more who experience rooflessness, houselessness, or inadequate, insecure accommodation. So that's getting at the invisibility of homelessness as well as exclusion from housing itself in many ways too. So I suppose just there are a number of questions or a number of reasons why this kind of study would be important in any context. In Ireland, I can offer you a few reasons, and perhaps in the Canadian context, there are some similar reasons as well to tease out. And the first of these is really that there is a really strong sociocultural narrative of home, and that's linked to historical links around land and house ownership and land and house rights or home ownership rights as well that would go back to our colonial history. So there is a very strong historical master narrative around our national identity being tied to ideas of land, home, and house ownership as well. And these narratives are certainly still found to be influential in the connections between home and identity in later life for some cohorts of older people in Ireland. That said, we're also undergoing the most severe housing and homelessness crisis in our state's history, and this crisis has certainly tipped over into the aging demographic that we see now in our homeless populations. So although the absolute numbers might seem small here in terms of the number of individuals aged 45 years and older, what we're finding is that this represents a larger and increasingly larger proportion of the adult homelessness population, so 29%. So I think in North American context, that might be 30 to 35%, depending on where you are, maybe even perhaps more. But in certain regions of Ireland, we have seen a threefold increase in those aged 65 and over. So this is a pattern that's increasingly evident and increasingly manifest in various different statistics. And again, this just reinforces why it's important to look at this topic here. Okay, so in terms of what we did, well, we employed an in-depth qualitative approach that tried to prioritize lived experience perspective. We drew on one focus group discussion with 5 older people and 24 in-depth life course interviews. So this is a small scale nature in terms of data collection, but we were trying to very much focus on the depth. The work itself was collected as a part of a larger study on positive health and aging for groups that can experience environmental insecurity and various multifaceted forms of exclusion. So I think just to maybe position these data collection instruments in their own right, it's probably helpful to take a minute just to talk about that research design. So this work was conducted with older people who are experiencing homelessness, but also older members of the Irish Traveller community, which is an indigenous ethnic community in Ireland. And essentially what we did was we started by conducting focus groups with representatives of these communities or members of these communities, and also with representatives from service providers and stakeholders that are there to support these communities. We then drew a sample of participants from each of these focus groups together in what we termed a consultative forum. And within that forum, we tried to agree what were the key research areas that we really needed to investigate, or key questions that we really needed to investigate in subsequent forms of data collection. And then these essentially informed the design of life course interviews and also some peer research training projects as well, but we're going to concentrate on the life course interviews today. And we conducted those interviews, and then we brought the data back to the same consultative forum to agree what are the key recommendations. So those recommendations were around policy, around aging in place agendas, and also around home care and community-based care as well. Now, those recommendations don't apply to what I'm presenting you today, but I think it is important to recognize that the two sets of data collection elements that I'm going to draw out are within this broader design, if you like. So then, returning to our sample for our analysis for this paper, we included 24 men and 5 women who were experiencing long-term homelessness, ranging in age from 50 to 74 years. The majority of people lived in short-term temporary accommodation. Some others lived in long-term temporary homeless accommodation. Within the sample, there was also experience of foreign national migration, also foreign national return migration, and experiences of prison and incarceration as well. Despite targeted efforts, we weren't able to include anybody who was currently sleeping rough at the time, but certainly people had experiences of this in the recent past and certainly spoke very much about that as well. And then I guess the sample is what you would imagine would be in terms of just encompassing a diversity of reasons for homelessness that you would often see within the literature and within practice descriptions as well. So family relationship breakdown, economic hardship, unemployment, substance use, and just bad luck in a lot of cases as well. In terms of the topics that we covered, we would have addressed areas such as practices related to health and aging, supports and coping strategies around those elements, and very importantly for this analysis, ideas of belonging, exclusion, and home. And in this latter topic, we would have probed on these questions through questions around sense of belonging in the local area, where and when people felt like they most belonged and felt most at home, and also then questions around the meaning of home for individuals and how people could make particular places or the places that they were currently resident within more of a home as well. On top of that, we did also utilize a whole series of residential life paths, which just means that we graph out and draw out with participants people's experiences over time and over place, and allows us to kind of probe on these questions a little bit more and the answers a little bit more as well. We use an inductive thematic analysis form to unpack the different thematic areas, and I'm happy to go into those details a little bit more if you're interested in that form. So moving on to what we found, well, essentially I'm going to present the findings in 3 different parts. The first part is really to contextualize people's relationship with their environments, both in terms of their experiences of homelessness and their experiences of aging. The second part will concern the main findings, if you like, of the analysis, where I'll present domains of making and remaking home in later life. And the third part will deal with, I guess in many ways, the role of home as it was envisaged for the future for older people within this study, and particularly in relation to ideas of hope and recovery as well. So moving on to our first part, and essentially, in addition, I guess, to early life residential experiences and early life community experiences, relationships with surrounding environments currently for these individuals was heavily informed by specific homelessness pathways and the timing of those pathways as well. So for those who had aged into homelessness or where homelessness was a long-standing challenge, certainly people talked about displacements from stable environments that could commence in younger adulthood or even childhood, and effectively meant that homelessness or risk of homelessness was something that had to be dealt with right throughout people's lives and life courses as well. For those who had experienced homelessness for the first time in later life, well, essentially many of these participants contrasted past home stable abilities with the insecurities of some of the homeless accommodation environments that they found themselves resident within. And as this man talks about, sometimes older age and age-related conditions appear to compound that sense of insecurity, particularly when first becoming homeless. So as this man says, he says, when you're homeless for the first time, it's a shock to the system. You don't know where you are. You don't know where to go. You're just in zombie land. You're just completely lost. I mean, I was sleeping in the car for weeks, and when I had a kidney out, I had nowhere to go. Now, regardless of pathways into homelessness, quite a lot of participants would have highlighted, I guess, what they felt was the mismatch or the incongruency between some of the settings that they were resident in and their needs as older adults. And I suppose as this quote kind of succinctly sums up, there are just, I guess, in many cases, sort of chaotic environments that people found themselves within, where there was a lot of noise, lack of privacy, and more of a communal living nature that impacted on people's sense of well-being and sense of environmental security and mastery as well. Now, despite all the various different pathways and despite the various different experiences of these residential environments, it's also worth considering the nature of the transition into homelessness itself. And certainly people spoke about that. And while for some people it reflected sudden and abrupt changes in status, others it was very much gradual and was more imperceptible, sort of a weakening of ties to stable housing over time. But in many cases, it was really non-linear, and it really involved a sort of protracted cycle of moving in and out of homelessness and moving in and out of homeless conditions over time. And people highlighted this in the context of how this could kind of intensify feelings of being older and getting older. And so this man talks a little bit about this here, and he says, I was homeless all through the 90s from 1998 until 2015. I had been sober, and I got married in that time, and my whole life had turned around. In 2015, my father died first, and then my wife died. 52 years old, that's when I started drinking again. Between being back through detox and back through homelessness and back into hostels, back on the streets, I'd say I've aged 10 years within 3 years. Finally, in this first theme, there was also evidence of the influence and the capacity of macro-institutional societal structures to both create and effectively result in a transition into homelessness, but also help effectively sustain those experiences of homelessness as well. So people here talked about the Irish housing system, they talked about inadequate mental health supports. They also talked about their perception of how older adult homelessness was often forgotten and stigmatized within society. But more so, a lot of people actually highlighted institutional structures they came into contact with before becoming homelessness as a means that effectively embedded a sense of environmental insecurity that they carried with them into later life. So some people talked about the experiences of prison. Some people talked about the experiences of applying for and trying to await international protection and settlement. So that would be in what we would term as emergency resettlement centers. And some people, as this man will describe, talked about living in residential state care, and how ultimately these experiences undermined a sense of trust within a broader society or a broader community, undermined a sense of self-worth, and basically entrenched a real residential unease with respect to environments that people might be resident within. So this man describes this and he says, for the first 7 years of my life, I was in an orphanage. I blocked it out, and I'm still more or less still doing that. But I know mentally, physically, in every way, I was affected from it. So much that I carried on into my life. I settled down and I got married, bought a home, and I couldn't live in it, and I just headed to the road. So that's when he first decided to to become homeless, if you like, in that respect. Okay, so moving to the second part now, and here I'm going to present the domains of remaking home, or making or remaking home, and that's just the abbreviation element there. And essentially, it was in the context of these relationships with the environment, in the context of various different challenges that people had experienced, that people spoke about home in various different ways, and it was possible to identify 5 different domains. And these domains were areas that were really important for the sense of home, but were also areas where people sometimes spoke about exerting an agency or putting effort into really trying to enhance their lives in these areas as well. Now, what you will notice is that housing is not one of these domains. I would think that's partly because people didn't have access to housing, so it didn't come into that discussion. But in other ways, I think it's the fundamental tenets of housing that you see threaded through these domains in terms of stability, security, all of these elements. So that's certainly there. And people did talk about that enabling potential of housing as well. But we'll go through the domains and we'll take you through step by step. So the first domain is around continuity and environmental interactions. And essentially, this is just simply about people consciously or subconsciously appearing to work to try and maintain links with places that were important in their lives. For some individuals, this was very simply about remaining in a place that they had spent most of their life already. And it's how this longer tenure seemed to invoke a sense of permanence and a sense of connection despite being homelessness. Um, and as this next quote will kind of demonstrate, hopefully, that a lot of the time people reflect on their lifelong relationship with place. And this man describes this in the context in the ways that streetscapes around him invoke certain memories of his life, his relations, and his working life as well in the building trade. And he says, I've invested so much of myself in this city. I've invested a huge part of my life here in its people. I lie on the ground, I look back into the city, and I can drive up any road and I can say, I worked in that house, I done that house, I built that house there. For other individuals, it was much more about the practices that they saw as being really key for enabling a sense of home. And it was about trying to maintain connections to localities that provided amenities and facilities to allow them to actually preserve those practices. So this participant talks about this in the context of his religious beliefs and his spirituality. And he says, I would not move from my church, which is down the road from me. I lived in that church for 28 years. I used to come out in the morning times. These were little rituals that I had, you know, and people got to know me and they said, why would you come back? I said, I felt it was home. So the second domain then really kind of emphasized the importance of environmental stability in later life and the importance of that stability for a sense of home. But really this kind of involved a sort of comparative assessment in terms of trying to conduct a relative comparison between people's current circumstances and circumstances in the past or circumstances that they imagine for the future as well. So in the context of very risk-laden environments that many people had encountered, some participants really emphasized the sense of security and safety as being really key. And as you can see here, some participants reflected on, again, what they remembered was their homes previously, and they talked about this in the context of how home is a place to call your own. You know, to be able to lock the door, light the fire, turn on the television, and the wife beside you, and a nice meal. So that's much more than just environmental stability. There's many other things involved in that quote as well, but that gives you a sense of what people were kind of speaking to. For other individuals, they really felt that a true sense of security in the environments they were currently in was not achievable and kind of questioned whether or not that could ever be achievable in such environments. So this man talks about just not feeling safe and effectively as a result, not really belonging in these environments either. There was a number of participants that also pointed to the need for certainty in later life with respect to having a space of one's own and with respect to knowing that that space is yours for the immediate future. And while the vast majority of participants flagged that this was not possible within homeless accommodation environments where there was communal and transient populations and structures, where it was available for some people, as this older woman talks about in the context of receiving her own room, then this space could imbue a sense of home that was akin to, again, previous environments that people had been in. So this older lady talks about her room and she says, the sense of this is mine. I love my room. It's the smallest space I've ever lived in my entire life. But just to open your door and have privacy. What makes it home? Just the security of knowing it's your space. As a third domain, people really highlighted how a sense of home was relational and highlighted how relational happiness was often intertwined with those places that people felt most at home and most like they belonged as well. As you can imagine, many participants kind of focus very much on family relations as the dominant source of this happiness, but often also this dominant or sole source of this sense of home as well. And as this man describes, some people contrasted the sort of sense of community, sense of camaraderie that people can build up in some homeless accommodation settings with the lack of supportive family relations. And where those relations were not available, then people really felt that a sense of home was more unlikely, if you like. So this man talks about this and he says, some can feel at home, some can, but not me. I feel a sense of belonging here, camaraderie maybe, but not home. You wouldn't confine in communities like such as you would with family. So again, it was that stronger, more profound emotive sense that people sometimes talked about. At the same time, participants who were rebuilding links with estranged families and members of those families did talk about how the pathways to remaking a sense of home was once again becoming a little bit more obvious for them and becoming embedded within those home environments as well. So this man talks about this and he says, my own family were all there yesterday and said, you'll never want for nothing. You just come in and live near us. We'd be delighted. So that kind of setup is kind of coming back and setting my roots and living the remainder of my life out there where they are, and I want that. Okay, so the fourth domain, and hopefully you're all still here with me, is around belonging and place-based belonging. And I guess what was slightly unusual about this is that this place-based belonging was scaled at a wider regional level. So it wasn't to the immediate home environment or neighborhood or community, but it was to cities, regions, and nations in themselves. And in this case, many people talked about how these kinds of connections and attachments preserved a sense of home amidst all the different transient experiences and amidst the displacements. So this participant says this and says, geez, I love the city. All my best friends are here. I belong here. I wouldn't have it any other way. I still felt I belong even when homeless on the streets. When I was on the streets, I said, this is my town. Now, in many cases, what was very evident was that these kind of forms of scale belonging was very much closely linked to daily and longer term mobilities. So people talked about walking as a means of interacting with the wider environment and embedding themselves within that wider environment. But other people talked about diverse residential life course trajectories that had incorporated regional mobilities that seemed to effectively ingrain a sense of self in a wider environmental scale. And so this older man talks about this in the context of where home was, and he talks about it in the context of his relationship to Ireland. And he says, no, all of Ireland is my community. I take it all as one unit. I know there's 5 kingdoms within that. No, I don't have weak belonging. There's lovely people here, and the people around here love me. In some ways, these quotes seem like a bit of a romanticization, but when they're juxtaposed with all the various different kind of elements that people experience with respect to those displacements and experiences, you can see how they're trading off various different aspects in their lives. So the final domain is around choice and control, and understandably, choice and control was seen as a way to enhance the potential of being able to create a sense of home. But the relationship between these two factors and environmental conditions wasn't always straightforward and sometimes quite complex, where you have some older people, for example, talking about how their autonomy was greatest when sleeping rough, whereas other individuals talked about how temporary accommodation really provided the opportunities to regain control over their lives. That said, many individuals within the study who were resident within these environments were critical of accommodation administrative structures and the sort of regulations and restrictions that they saw as being in place and saw as restricting activities that they felt were really key to building a sense of home. So this man kind of sums this up and he says, this place is not a home. I mean, inside, outside, nowhere is home. Like, I mean, how can it be a home when you can't even cook meals? You have to accept what the bloody hell they give you here. For lots of other participants, there was a clear tension between being desperate for accommodation and being faced with the sort of upsetting instances that impacted long-term on people's well-being, but being in a position where they felt they were effectively having to accept these situations and circumstances in order to be able to get accommodation. And this older woman talks about this in terms of just receiving her own room. And she says, I'm in a room where a girl took her own life or committed suicide. And she was only after committing suicide when I came. So they said to me, come back in about 2 days' time. I didn't know, I didn't find out until the other day. So I'm a bit edgy about that, but I'm not going to leave my own room. There's no way. Okay, so into the final theme of the research findings. And here, I suppose, we're really trying to acknowledge the ways in which people talked about home in the context of what they envisaged for their own futures. And really, this was with respect to a role of a sense of home in reinforcing both a sense of hope and a sense of recovery where that applied to people's situations. So here, more than any of the other themes, there was a very understandable conflation between a sense of home and housing, but still the notion of home was very much linked to what people essentially described as characteristics of their self currently and in the future, and indeed what they hoped for the future as well. So for some individuals that were beginning to regain that sense of home, even in the context of homelessness experiences, they really looked at this as a marker or a milestone for reintegration. So they pointed to these home-like experiences within homeless accommodation environments that allowed them to effectively leverage a greater sense of self-efficacy and a rediscovery of self in so many ways. So this older woman talks about this, and he says, living here has been great. A sense of independence is fantastic here. I can't tell you enough about the place, how good it is. It's been unbelievable. I was just couch surfing. I was everywhere and nowhere. It was awful. I don't know how I went through it, to be honest. For other individuals where there was very clearly that absence of a sense of home, that really just reinforced a sense of aging out of place. And this man kind of sums this up, and he says, you have to have your own place where you can bring in your own friends rather than being in a hostel. But until such time as you regain privacy in my own place, you're lost. And that's my feeling. For a number of participants who were dealing with mental health, alcohol, or drug-related challenges, the absence of a sense of home seemed to intertwine with the sort of stigmatization that could sometimes be there about being homeless in later life, and in some accounts seemed to effectively impede that sense of recovery. So this older man talks about this in the context of wanting and needing to give up alcohol, and also wanting to rebuild relationships with key individuals in his life. So he says, my pride eats me up when I find myself in this situation, that I'm homeless in homeless accommodation at my age. I don't have contact with my daughter. I don't want to start up anything with her yet until I'm finished here. And this is why it's so important for me to have somewhere to call my home. Overall, in the context of this theme, a sense of home seemed to emerge both in its material and more effective components as an ambition for later life for many individuals. So this was obviously about physical dwellings and about how these dwellings can counter hazards of homelessness and detriments to emotional well-being, but it was also about people wanting to have the capacity and desire the capacity to shape home as a future goal for themselves, and a goal that would provide a sense of centeredness, a sense of territoriality, and a sense of relational connectedness as well. So this man talks about this as, my goal was to have my own place by the time I was 60 because of the winters hitting in. And I said, you won't be able for it. It's not so much the winters that I'm not able for, it's the loss and the constant living in that frame of mind. Home is everything I'm going to make it when I get mine. That'll be home. But I'll have a border on it. It'll be my border, and I'll protect the house, and I'll protect anyone that's there. Okay. So on to discussion. If I'm okay for time, that's okay. Great.
Yeah, you're fine. Thumbs up.
Great. Thanks, Esme. So I guess in many ways, it's probably most appropriate to think about this kind of representation as one view of a sense of home and remaking home in later life homelessness, and very particular to the participants that took part in this study. And I think that contextualization is needed because ultimately we're talking about an Irish case, and we're also talking about a very small population group, our participant sample within this study. At the same time, the findings aren't really surprising. The fact that continuity, stability, relationships, belonging, and control and choice emerge as the key elements of some of these domains is somewhat unexpected, and perhaps something that we can all relate to, regardless of the sort of environmental conditions that we live in. So the domains really reflect the sort of broader themes we see within the literature around remaking home after homelessness, or indeed the even wider literature around home in older age that's within environmental gerontology. But there are a number of distinctions here that I think we need to kind of pull out and draw out that reflect a little bit more of a nuanced positioning of these findings in the context of people's lives in homelessness. And so to do that for the last few minutes, I'm going to take you through this only slightly complicated diagram, and one that really isn't that pretty at all. Usually I can color them up, but in this case it hasn't worked. So I'm going to take you through this diagram piece by piece, and we're going to start with the domains of home. So again, as a reminder, this involved environmental continuity, comparative stability, relational happiness, scale belonging, and choice and control. And I hope you can see those on your screen. And essentially, these domains encapsulate sort of the areas and the means through which older people potentially could remake a sense of home in later life homelessness, but they also very critically pointed to the sort of detractors from that potential. So it's not really appropriate that we think about these domains as simple outcome states, and instead we need to kind of acknowledge the more processual quality where people almost conveyed a sort of continuum for each domain where they try to exert their agency to improve their living conditions or living elements around each of these elements. So working to try and increase stability, working to try and increase relational happiness, working to try and maintain links with place and home. And this was all about leveraging a greater possibility of remaking a sense of
Part
home.
of like
Sorry. Okay. So in many ways, these just kind of make sense as areas where we can invest in to try and support those agencies in terms of interventions and more targeted interventions as well. But across these domains, we can kind of unpack, I suppose, if you like, what people were applying in respect to those agencies. And we see a very wide set of agencies that were evident across the different thematic areas. And this is about how people try to improve their situations through behavioral elements, such as actions and practices, through emotional aspects with respect to bonds, attachments, and memories, or through cognitive elements in terms of appraisals and comparisons. We also have to acknowledge that these agencies are likely to stem from individual level resources accumulated across the life course. So this might be physical and cognitive health, personal, material and social resources, but also resilience that is bolstered by the sort of challenges that people overcome in their daily lives, and perhaps also undermined by those very same challenges that that people may not have been successful in overcoming. And as we kind of add these in to our picture in terms of driving these agencies and resources, we do have to think about how these agencies and resources are also subject to age-related changes. Changes at the individual level with respect to health, social connections and income, but also at the more structural and positional and symbolic level in terms of how societies position older people and aging experiences as well. I think a key distinction here, though, is that participants in this research appear to be trying to remake a sense of home amidst really significant constraints and amidst very significant changes that had created a prolonged disruption in people's relationship with their environments and their links to that connection and that idea of home as well. So in that respect, we have to acknowledge both the strength of individuals and their capacity for resilience, but we also have to acknowledge that remaking home here emerged as a process that involved more of a restorative trait, was more relative in nature, and was conditioned very much on more minor gains in people's lives. And it's this kind of characterization of the process that draws back to all those other factors that people alluded to within the context of research findings that could impact on that sense of home and their capacities to either exert agency or to have the autonomy to exert agency as well. So in that context, we can think about how this might include all the dislocations and relocations that people have to contend with in their lives. We can think about all the place environments that people were resident in or interacted with across regions, across localities, and across homeless accommodation environments. We can think about the homeless accommodation structures themselves within these homeless accommodation environments and how they sometimes could have a specific power over the agency or the application of agency in people's capacity to engage in these different areas that are important to people in their lives. And we also have to think about more the macro trends around housing systems and housing policy, around homelessness systems, but also how we support older people and older people in homelessness with respect to policy and practice, or indeed neglect them within that policy and practice as well, which is certainly the case in the Irish context. On top of that, I think if we go back to the very first theme, we also have to acknowledge how earlier life experiences and interactions with various different environments and our interactions with homelessness could impinge on different ideas of what home meant, and different capacities to try and create and exert that agency as well across different sets. So for that reason, we can think about experiences of homelessness itself, experiences of place earlier in life, but we can also think about those institutional structures that people interacted with, and we can think about macro historic trends and policies that perhaps might have resulted in a higher risk of homelessness for people within their lives, and sustain those risks as well. So in sum then, we can look at this diagram, and hopefully you'll see that the sense of home in later life and remaking a sense of home in later life homelessness is a potential product of all these different domain areas, the agenetic processes that are involved, and their interaction with all of these different factors. We can also, though, highlight that this is probably a circular process where a sense of home within the international literature in itself can serve to further reinforce agency in remaking home. So there should be a feedback loop there in some ways. But I guess there is a kind of key question that's really important at the end of this, and that's about whether or not people actually felt they achieved a sense of home. And certainly there's enough evidence within the research itself to indicate that some people perhaps had. But for the vast majority, they had not by any measure. And some people, it was very clear that they had never achieved a sense of home. And I suppose in that respect, really what the findings point to is more survival style efforts, which we were cautioned about from the international literature, that are essentially, and these efforts are essentially challenged by deprivations, relocations, and the daily constraints that can impact on people. At the same time, we would argue that there are enough insights here to suggest that we need to be cognizant of and recognize the hopeful and restorative qualities of home that people did account for and did talk about. And in that way, we have to recognize and be cognizant of the enabling potential of a sense of home in later life, and how this effectively is key, not just for remaking a sense of home, but also key to older adult well-being. So what we would argue that we've somewhat reflected is more of a future-orientated process where sense of home serves as one potential outcome, but is also a component in a broader process of ongoing identity and well-being development. And in longer term trajectory, and if we want to throw in the term circular there, we probably need to do that as well. And really, this is just reflecting how individuals did negotiate uncertainty, did negotiate risk to move closer to a sense of home in their own minds in different ways. But ethically and practically, we can't burden older people in these circumstances and situations with the responsibility to constantly have to negotiate that risk, or to think that their failure to really achieve a sense of home is anyway a reflection of themselves in that way. And ultimately, we have to just acknowledge that there are just so many variables for any one person to contend with, that any success in achieving that kind of home-like feeling is anything really other than chance. So stable housing is a critical foundation block for increasing the probability of success, but it's not the only factor. So we would suggest that the domains are areas where interventions could be targeted and agencies supported. And I guess that begins really with individual level engagement with older people to really be able to empower their agency, to really be able to support their agency and their aspirations for ideas around home and later life well-being. But also because of the very significant structural issues that people were contending with, that integration of lived experience perspective has to go beyond the individual level, and we need certainly a recalibration, a reorientation of policy development to attend to those voices, which is certainly not happening in the Irish context and not happening in many international contexts as well. And without that, I think we'll always have very significant impediments in terms of people being able to achieve that sense of home, whether in homelessness or beyond it. Okay, so thank you very much for listening to me. There's a couple of links here to various different outputs from the project. These are kind of practical briefing reports on different aspects of positive health and aging and different aspects around home care experiences and preferences for the broader groups from this larger study. And there's also a set of publications that are from this broader study as well. Thanks very much.